52 German soldiers abandoned a perfectly prepared defensive position. No artillery, no assault, not a single shot fired. They retreated because they believed they were about to be surrounded, but they weren't. There was no attacking force, no encirclement, no reinforcements moving into position. What forced them to withdraw was not American firepower, but a mistake in how the human brain interprets threat under uncertainty. This is not a story about bravery. It's not a story about superior tactics, and it's not a story about technology. It's about how fear fills the gaps when information is incomplete, and how one decision, made under the illusion of danger, quietly collapsed an entire defensive line in World War II. Want more untold World War II stories that focus on decisions, not just battles? Consider subscribing. In military history, retreat is often explained as a failure of courage, a breakdown of discipline, a moment where fear overpowers training. But that explanation is wrong. Professional soldiers do not retreat because they panic. They retreat because they calculate. Every withdrawal in war begins with an assumption, a mental model of what is happening beyond the edge of certainty. And when that model is wrong, even the most disciplined units can make decisions that appear irrational in hindsight, but feel completely logical in the moment. World War II was not decided only by firepower, logistics, or manpower. It was also decided by how commanders interpreted incomplete information under extreme stress. Nowhere was this more dangerous than in environments where visibility collapsed and certainty disappeared. Forests, mountains, fog. In these conditions, sound often becomes more influential than sight. And the human brain, wired to detect threats faster than it can verify them, begins to fill in gaps with assumptions. Military doctrine rarely prepares soldiers for this. Armies train extensively for visible threats. Enemy formations, weapons systems, known positions. They train far less for ambiguity. Yet ambiguity is where the most catastrophic errors occur. Because under uncertainty, the human brain does not ask, "What is happening?" Before taker, it asks, "What is the worst thing that could be happening if you have today?" This is not a flaw of weak minds. It is a survival mechanism. Evolution did not reward hesitation when danger was possible. It rewarded early reaction even at the cost of occasional false alarms. In combat, this bias becomes lethal. A commander who waits too long to confirm a threat risks encirclement. A commander who reacts early risks abandoning a strong position. Between these two options, doctrine almost always favors survival. Encirclement is one of the most feared scenarios in warfare. Not because it is always fatal, but because once it begins, it is extremely difficult to reverse. History had already taught this lesson long before 1944. Units surrounded on the Eastern Front were often destroyed even when they were well supplied and well armed. Not because they lacked firepower, but because once multiple threat vectors emerged, coordination collapsed. Experienced commanders internalized this pattern. They learned that the first signs of encirclement rarely look dramatic. They are subtle, unexpected movement, unclear signals, sounds that do not align with what the eyes can confirm. By the time encirclement becomes visually obvious, it is usually too late. So when trained officers detect early indicators, even ambiguous ones, doctrine encourages them to act decisively. This is where perception becomes more important than reality. A threat does not need to exist to influence behavior. It only needs to be believable. In World War II, countless engagements were decided before the first shot was fired, not by deception units or complex ruses, but by how commanders interpreted incomplete sensory data. The battlefield was not a chessboard. It was a fog of noise, echoes, shadows, and assumptions. In this environment, sound carried enormous weight. Gunfire could be measured. Artillery could be triangulated. But sound without a visible source was different. It suggested movement beyond sight, coordination beyond observation, intent beyond confirmation. Sound implied planning, and planning implied numbers. This is why armies developed elaborate signal systems, whistles, calls, coded shouts, to coordinate movement under fire. These sounds were meant to be understood by allies and ignored by enemies. But when an enemy heard unfamiliar sounds, especially ones that seemed organized, the brain interpreted them through the only framework it had: threat patterns learned from previous combat. Under stress, The brain does not ask whether a sound is authentic. It asks whether the pattern matches danger. When it does, the response is immediate. In training manuals, this process is never described in emotional terms. It is described as risk management. A commander facing uncertainty must choose the option that preserves the fighting force. If the threat is real and he stays, his unit may be destroyed. Threat is false, and he withdraws. He loses ground, but preserves lives. This asymmetry biases decisions toward retreat when ambiguity suggests danger. World War II produced thousands of such decisions, most of them forgotten, buried in after-action reports that simply state, enemy pressure forced withdrawal. IF. Rarely do those reports capture the psychological chain reaction that led to the decision. Rarely do they ask whether the pressure actually existed. By late 1944, the European theater was filled with exhausted, experienced units on both sides. Commanders were no longer idealists. They were survivors. They trusted patterns more than optimism, experience more than hope. This made them effective and vulnerable. Vulnerable not to brute force, but to misinterpretation, because the more experience a commander has, the more weight he gives to familiar danger signals. And when those signals appear even faintly, the brain does not pause to question them. It acts. The event this video examines did not succeed because of bravery. It did not succeed because of superior numbers or better weapons. It succeeded because it exploited a predictable cognitive shortcut. A shortcut every trained commander relies on. A shortcut that says, if the signs point to encirclement, withdraw now or die later. What followed was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was the collapse of a defensive position triggered by a threat that existed only in the mind, and it began with a sound. Autumn of 1944. The war in Western Europe had entered a dangerous phase. On maps, the situation appeared straightforward. Allied forces were advancing. German lines were retreating. The momentum favored the Americans. But maps lie. What they conceal is friction, the accumulation of terrain, weather, exhaustion, and uncertainty that turns progress into vulnerability. Nowhere was this friction more severe than in the mountainous forest regions of eastern France. These were not open battlefields. They were environments that punished visibility and rewarded misjudgment. Dense trees blocked lines of sight. Uneven slopes distorted distance. Fog erased depth and scale. In such terrain, conventional superiority meant less than doctrine suggested. High ground was critical, but only if it could be held with awareness. Firepower mattered, but only if targets could be clearly identified. Numbers helped, but only if coordination remained intact. And coordination depended on perception. By late 1944, American units pushing through these regions were operating at the edge of logistical and psychological endurance. They advanced through territory that had been contested, abandoned, and retaken multiple times. Roads were unreliable. Communications were fragile. Front lines were fluid. German forces, though retreating overall, were still capable of creating lethal local advantages. They relied on prepared positions rather than maneuver, entrenched defenses rather than mobile operations. This asymmetry created a deceptive environment. American units often assumed they were advancing against weakened opposition. German units assumed they were facing probing forces designed to draw them into traps. Both assumptions were dangerous. In this phase of the war, encounters were rarely clean engagements. They were collisions between incomplete information sets, and in these collisions, terrain played an active role. Forests distort sound in ways urban or open environments do not. Echoes do not behave predictably. Distance becomes difficult to judge. A single noise can appear closer than it is. Multiple noises can blend into one. Movement can seem continuous when it is not. Military training acknowledges this, but only abstractly. Doctrine teaches soldiers to expect confusion. It does not teach them how to override instinct when confusion feels threatening. This matters because human perception evolved for survival, not accuracy. In environments where vision fails, hearing takes precedence, and hearing is more easily manipulated. Sound implies presence. Presence implies intent. Intent implies planning. Planning suggests numbers. This cognitive chain is automatic. It does not require fear. It requires only uncertainty. By 1944, German commanders in the West were acutely sensitive to the possibility of encirclement. They had learned this lesson brutally on the Eastern Front. There, entire units had vanished, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they hesitated when warning signs appeared. Encirclement rarely announced itself clearly. It emerged through fragments, a sound where there should be none, movement on a flank that could not be confirmed, signals that did not align with visual information. Commanders who ignored these fragments often paid with their lives. Those who reacted early survived, even if the threat later proved smaller than expected. Survival reinforced the lesson. By the time these officers were redeployed to Western Europe, the pattern was deeply ingrained. Ambiguity plus unfamiliar signals equaled danger. This created a battlefield psychology where defensive strength could become a liability. A well-prepared position anchored a unit in place. Anchoring increased vulnerability to encirclement. Vulnerability amplified sensitivity to perceived threats. In such conditions, the strongest positions were often abandoned not under fire, but under suspicion. The environment rewarded decisiveness over certainty. This was not cowardice. It was rational adaptation. But rational adaptation can be exploited. The American side did not fully understand this dynamic at the doctrinal level. Their training emphasized movement, coordination, and firepower. Psychological manipulation was not a formal tool at the platoon level. It was considered the domain of specialized units or higher command. War rarely unfolds according to doctrine. At the small unit level, survival often depends on improvisation. Not every advantage is technological. Not every weapon is physical. In environments dominated by ambiguity, perception itself becomes the battlefield. This is where the conventional narrative of World War II often fails. It portrays victory as the product of overwhelming force applied methodically. It underplays the countless micro-decisions made in isolation, without clear information. Decisions made by officers who did not know the broader picture, who could not see beyond the trees, who could only interpret fragments and act accordingly. The encounter at the center of this story unfolded within this exact context. Not a grand offensive, not a decisive battle, but a moment where environment, experience, and uncertainty intersected, where doctrine met reality and reality bent perception. The American unit involved was not operating under a master plan. They were navigating terrain that erased the advantages of scale. The German unit opposing them was not preparing for heroics. They were managing risk. Both sides were trapped in a battlefield that rewarded misinterpretation. The outcome was not determined by who was stronger. It was determined by who understood, even unintentionally, how the other side thought. Before any sound was made, before any movement triggered alarm, the conditions for collapse already existed. The forest had done its work. The fog had done its work. Experience had done its work. All that remained was a stimulus. Something small, something unfamiliar, something that fit a known danger pattern. When it came, the decision would already be made. Tactical level, disaster rarely announces itself loudly. It emerges quietly, when every available option carries unacceptable risk. By the time the American platoon reached the edge of the forested slope, they were already operating on borrowed certainty. Their maps were outdated, their assumptions incomplete, their visibility collapsing by the minute. They believed they were approaching a lightly defended area. They were wrong. What lay ahead was not a weakened screen, but a prepared defensive position occupying higher ground, the kind designed to punish movement, not withstand assault. From below, the slope offered no cover. From above, the defenders commanded clear fields of fire. This was the most dangerous configuration in small unit warfare. Exposed attackers beneath concealed defenders. In such a configuration, initiative disappears. A frontal advance would mean crossing open ground under observation. Casualties would occur before the attackers reached effective firing range. A retreat would require turning backs on elevated positions. Movement alone would trigger engagement. Even remaining stationary carried risk. Static units invite artillery, flanking maneuvers, or reinforcement of the enemy position. The platoon was not facing defeat. They were facing constraint. Constraint is more dangerous than firepower because it removes agency. At this stage of combat, doctrine provides little guidance. Manuals describe ideal responses to ideal scenarios. This was not one of them. The Americans were outnumbered, not catastrophically but decisively enough that errors would not be forgiven. German forces in prepared positions did not need numerical superiority to dominate. They needed patience. The Americans understood this instinctively. Time favored the defenders. Every minute spent deliberating increased the chance of detection. Every moment of visibility increased the probability of incoming fire. And yet, movement was equally dangerous. This is the tactical paradox that destroys units. When all actions are risky, hesitation becomes fatal, but rash action is worse. In such moments, leadership is reduced to triage, not choosing the best option, choosing the least lethal one. Experienced soldiers recognize this moment immediately. The tone changes. Movements slow, voices drop. Men stop thinking in terms of objectives and start thinking in terms of survival. This is not panic. It is recalibration. Fear does not arrive as chaos. It arrives as focus. The human brain narrows its attention, scanning for exit paths. But in this terrain, exits did not exist. The forest eliminated visibility. The slope eliminated cover. The enemy eliminated time. At the same moment, the German unit above faced a different calculation. They had the advantage. They held the ground. They observed movement below. But they also lacked certainty. From their position, the Americans appeared isolated, but isolation can be deceptive. In this phase of the war, American forces rarely advanced blindly. Movement often preceded larger maneuvers. German doctrine emphasized caution against probes designed to fix defenders in place, while flanking units maneuvered unseen. The forest made such maneuvers plausible. The fog made them invisible. This created asymmetry of fear. The Americans feared immediate annihilation. The Germans feared delayed encirclement. Both fears were rational. Both were based on incomplete information, and both pushed decision-makers toward caution. This is where battlefield psychology begins to fracture. The Americans below could not see beyond the slope. The Germans above could not see beyond the trees. Neither side knew how alone the other truly was. The battlefield had become a mirror of assumptions. In these moments, small stimuli gained disproportionate power. A branch snapping, a shadow shifting, a sound that does not fit expectation. The brain interprets these signals not in isolation, but in patterns. Patterns built from memory. German officers in 1944 carried memories of catastrophic encirclements. American soldiers carried memories of ambushes that began exactly like this. Neither memory encouraged patience. What followed did not begin as a plan. It began as recognition that the situation could not be resolved through standard tactics. No amount of marksmanship would solve the slope. Formation would overcome the elevation. No discipline would erase the geometry. This recognition is dangerous because it creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite improvisation. Improvisation in combat is often romanticized as brilliance. In reality, it is desperation structured into action. The moment one soldier steps outside doctrine, the situation shifts. Not because doctrine was wrong, but because doctrine assumes stability. This battlefield offered none. Improvisation is risky, but so is waiting. At this point, the American platoon was approaching the threshold where indecision would become visibility. Once fully exposed, the outcome would no longer be ambiguous. The Germans would fire. Casualties would follow. The slope would become a killing zone. What mattered now was not strength, not courage, not training. What mattered was changing the decision environment. This is a concept rarely discussed outside high-level strategy. Decision environments determine which options feel acceptable. Change the environment, and rational decisions change with it. The Americans could not improve their firepower. They could not improve their position. They could not improve their numbers. But they could unintentionally alter how the enemy interpreted the situation. The Germans were not waiting to attack. They were waiting to understand. This hesitation was subtle, but it existed, and hesitation creates opportunity. The battlefield was no longer about winning. It was about forcing the enemy to choose wrong, not through deception in the traditional sense, not through false signals or dummy units, but through triggering a familiar danger pattern, a pattern the German brain already knew how to respond to. What happened next would not involve weapons. It would not involve orders shouted or formations changed. It would involve perception. And once perception shifted, the outcome would follow, not because anyone lost control, but because everyone followed training exactly as designed. Combat. Decisions are rarely made when conditions are clear. They are made when clarity is disappearing. By this point, the American platoon had reached that threshold. They were no longer asking how to advance. They were asking how to avoid being destroyed. This distinction matters. Advancement requires confidence. Survival requires timing. The men below the slope understood that time was no longer neutral. Every passing minute increased exposure. Every second of hesitation narrowed the margin for error. But the most dangerous realization came quietly. The situation could not be solved by doing more. It required changing what the enemy believed was happening. This is where traditional narratives often collapse into myth. They describe a sudden flash of genius, a heroic impulse, a bold act of courage. What actually occurs is far less dramatic. It is a moment where someone recognizes that the problem is not physical but cognitive. The Americans could not escape the geometry of the slope. They could not overcome elevation with discipline. They could not wait out a defender who had the advantage. But they could introduce uncertainty. Uncertainty is not confusion. It is instability. And instability forces reassessment. On a battlefield dominated by ambiguity, reassessment is dangerous, because reassessment delays action. And delay in combat often favors withdrawal. The critical insight was not about deception in the classic sense. No false flags. No staged movement. It was about stimulus. What kind of stimulus would force the enemy to reevaluate the situation? The answer lay not in doctrine but in experience. German commanders had learned to fear encirclement above all else, not because it always ended in defeat, but because it ended in loss of control. Encirclement multiplies uncertainty. It fragments communication. It creates multiple threat vectors where only one existed before. Once that perception takes hold, staying becomes riskier than leaving. This logic is deeply ingrained. A commander who withdraws early preserves his unit. A commander who waits too long loses it. This is not cowardice. It is probability management. The Americans did not need to convince the Germans they were losing. They only needed to convince them they might soon lose control. This distinction is crucial. Fear of defeat is abstract. Fear of encirclement is immediate. Encirclement implies inevitability. The question, then, was how to suggest encirclement without revealing force. How to introduce the idea of multiple directions without exposing numbers. The environment offered the answer. The forest distorted sound. The fog eliminated visual confirmation. The slope separated perception from reality. In such an environment, sound could do what movement could not. Sound travels without revealing source. Sound suggests presence without requiring proof. Sound creates patterns the brain feels compelled to interpret. And most importantly, sound implies coordination. Coordination implies planning. Planning implies numbers. At this point, the decision did not require approval from higher command. There was no time. Small unit warfare rarely allows for permission. It allows only for judgment. Judgment made under pressure, without certainty. The choice to act was not dramatic. It was quiet. A recognition that waiting would resolve nothing. And that action, even unconventional action, might change the enemy's calculus. This is where improvisation enters the story not as brilliance, but as necessity. Improvisation does not emerge from creativity alone. It emerges from constraint. When all conventional options fail, unconventional ones become acceptable. The Americans were not attempting to overpower the enemy. They were attempting to interrupt the enemy's decision loop. This concept is rarely discussed at the tactical level. Decision loops govern how quickly a commander observes, interprets, decides, and acts. Disrupt that loop and even a superior position becomes unstable. A commander forced to reassess cannot act decisively. A commander who cannot act decisively becomes vulnerable. The Americans did not need to sustain the disruption. They only needed to trigger it. Once triggered, experience would do the rest. The German unit above had fought long enough to recognize patterns. They knew what encirclement felt like before it was visible. They knew the warning signs. Unfamiliar signals, ambiguous movement, threats that could not be visually confirmed. Once those signs appeared, doctrine encouraged caution. Caution encouraged withdrawal. The Americans were not exploiting ignorance. They were exploiting experience. This is the paradox. The more experienced a commander is, the more vulnerable he becomes to familiar danger patterns. What followed was not an attack. It was not a maneuver. It was the introduction of a stimulus designed to fit a known threat template. A stimulus that required no confirmation, only interpretation. The battlefield did not change. The positions did not change. The numbers did not change. But the frame did. And once the frame changed, the outcome was already in motion. The next phase would not be decided by strength. It would be decided by perception. And perception, once destabilized, is difficult to recover. What happened next unfolded quickly, not because it was chaotic, but because it followed logic that had already been written by experience. Stimulus did not announce itself dramatically. There was no explosion, no sudden movement. It arrived as sound, not a single, identifiable source, but a presence. Sound that did not behave as expected. Sound that moved. Sound that suggested coordination without revealing structure. In an environment where visibility had already collapsed, this mattered more than any weapon. The human brain is not designed to analyze sound spatially under stress. It estimates, it guesses, and then it commits. In forests, sound rarely travels in straight lines. It reflects, it fragments, it arrives out of sequence. This creates a phenomenon where direction becomes uncertain, but distribution becomes apparent. One sound is dismissed. Several sounds are interpreted as force. The moment this threshold is crossed, the brain stops asking what is making the noise, and starts asking how many. This is where reality loses its authority. From the German positions above, the sounds did not indicate contact. They indicated movement. Movement implies intent. Intent implies planning. Planning implies command. And command implies numbers. This chain does not require confirmation. It requires only plausibility. The environment supplied the rest. Echoes overlapped. Intervals shortened. Pauses suggested coordination rather than randomness. To the trained ear, this did not sound like panic. It sounded like maneuver. This distinction is critical. Untrained soldiers fear chaos. Experienced ones fear order they cannot see. Order suggests purpose. The German unit had been watching the Americans below. They believed they understood the situation. Now that understanding was eroding. The sounds did not match the visual information. The pattern did not align with what they thought they were observing. This mismatch forced reassessment. Reassessment under combat conditions is dangerous because it delays action, and delay creates windows for disaster. At this point, the German commander was no longer evaluating the Americans he could see. He was evaluating the Americans he could not. This is the psychological inversion that decides outcomes. Visible threats are finite. Invisible ones are not. Invisible threats invite imagination. And imagination, under stress, always scales upward. The possibility of encirclement does not require evidence. It requires only enough indicators to make delay feel irresponsible. Every additional second spent holding position increased the risk of confirmation. Confirmation that would arrive too late to respond. From the commander's perspective, the logic was brutally simple. If the sounds indicated a maneuvering force, staying meant potential capture or annihilation. If the sounds were deception, withdrawing meant loss of terrain but survival. Doctrine does not reward the defense of ground at the cost of forces. It rewards preservation. The sound had done its work. The battlefield geometry amplified it. Experience interpreted it. Doctrine validated it. No one needed to panic. They only needed to decide. And the decision was not dramatic. It was procedural. A controlled withdrawal. Secondary positions. Orderly movement. Exactly how experienced units disengage when uncertainty becomes unacceptable. This is the final irony. The success of the maneuver did not depend on chaos. It depended on discipline. The German unit did not flee. They withdrew. They did not break formation. They executed doctrine. This made the outcome irreversible. Once movement began, the assumption of encirclement became self-reinforcing. Movement confirmed threat. Threat justified movement. By the time the sound ceased, the decision loop had closed. The position above the slope was abandoned. What had been a near-perfect defensive site moments earlier was now empty, not because it had been overpowered, but because its defenders no longer believed it could be held safely. Below, the Americans did not immediately understand what had happened. There was no signal of victory, no visual confirmation, only absence. The absence of fire, the absence of movement, the absence of threat. Silence followed, the kind that only occurs when intent has left the battlefield. When they advanced cautiously, they found positions prepared for days of defense, left behind without a fight. Weapons abandoned, supplies untouched. Geometry had not changed. The numbers had not changed, but the interpretation had. A battle that could not be won by force had been resolved entirely within the enemy's decision-making process. This is the moment where most stories end, with disbelief, with relief, with astonishment at how close disaster had been. But this moment, powerful as it was, mattered less than what followed, because the true impact of the decision was not local. It was systemic. The withdrawal did not merely remove one unit. It created a gap that would be exploited, a gap that would ripple outward. The collapse had begun not with fire, but with a single misinterpreted signal. Dangerous effects of a battlefield decision are rarely immediate. They unfold quietly, downstream, long after the moment feels resolved. What happened on that forested slope did not end with an empty position. It created a gap, not just a physical gap in a defensive line, but a cognitive one, a break in confidence that could not be easily repaired. In static defenses, continuity matters more than strength. A single abandoned position forces neighboring units to adjust. They shorten lines. They redistribute forces. They cover angles that were never meant to be exposed. Every adjustment introduces friction. What had been a coherent defensive system becomes reactive. And reaction is always slower than planning. The German withdrawal was logical in isolation. But warfare does not evaluate decisions in isolation. It evaluates interactions. The abandoned position had anchored a broader defensive scheme. Its purpose was not simply to repel attackers, but to stabilize the line around it. Once it was gone, the system recalibrated imperfectly. American units advancing through the sector encountered less resistance than expected. Not because German forces had collapsed, but because they were repositioning to compensate for uncertainty. Uncertainty spreads. When one unit withdraws unexpectedly, neighboring commanders ask why. They do not assume error, they assume threat. If a position fell without engagement, it suggests unseen pressure. Pressure implies maneuver. Maneuver implies coordination. The logic repeats. This is how localized perception errors scale into operational consequences. Not through panic. Through inference, each commander adjusts based on incomplete explanations. Each adjustment reinforces the original assumption. The Germans did not need to believe they were outmatched everywhere. They only needed to believe that something was happening they could not see. That belief slowed response times. It altered patrol patterns. It redirected reserves. All of this occurred without a single American unit deliberately exploiting it. Momentum does not require intention. It requires imbalance. The American advance in that sector accelerated not because of superior force, but because resistance became uneven. Strong points held, but coordination between them weakened. Gaps appeared not in manpower, but in confidence. This distinction matters. World War II is often described as a contest of production and logistics, and at scale, that is true. But on the ground, campaigns are decided by chains of micro-decisions. Decisions made by officers who do not know they are responding to an illusion. The event examined in this story did not introduce a new weapon. It revealed a vulnerability that exists in all armies. No doctrine fully accounts for how humans interpret ambiguity under threat. Training teaches recognition of known dangers. It cannot teach recognition of false ones. The irony is unavoidable. The same experience that keeps commanders alive also makes them predictable. Predictability is not weakness. It is structure, and structure can be exploited. What happened on that slope worked once, not because it was clever, but because it aligned perfectly with how trained minds assess risk. The outcome was not accidental. It was consistent with decades of battlefield psychology. This is why the incident did not become formal doctrine. You cannot standardize improvisation. You cannot mass-produce intuition. The conditions that made it possible were rare, but the principle was universal. Victory did not come from overwhelming the enemy. It came from convincing him that time was no longer on his side. In war, time is the one resource that cannot be replaced. Once a commander believes he is losing control of time, he prioritizes survival over position. This choice is always defensible, and often irreversible. Long after the ground was taken, the story persisted, not as a tactical lesson, but as a reminder of something uncomfortable, that modern warfare, for all its technology, still hinges on ancient human instincts. Fear of isolation, fear of encirclement, fear of acting too late. These instincts are not flaws, they are adaptations, but adaptations can be turned against those who rely on them. The broader lesson is not about sound, or terrain, or even deception. About understanding the invisible architecture of decision-making. Wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought inside minds, with assumptions, patterns, and expectations. Change those, and outcomes follow. What happened next did not change the course of the entire war, but it saved lives, it opened space, and it demonstrated a truth that armies still struggle to confront. The greatest force on a battlefield is not firepower, it is belief. And once belief shifts, even the strongest positions become temporary. This story changed how you think about warfare. The next video on your screen explores another moment where a single decision quietly reshaped World War II.